Hey guys, I'm here today with my Evil Eye Ominagruzio deck list. Some of you wanted to see some of our Dark States lists, and this is one, honestly for me, the only Masque deck that I liked during the Masque era. So to start us off, we have one of the best cards in the game.
Cute kitties.
Yes, I like my cats. Your standard starter, then you have Ominagruzio. For Soul Blast, you can check the top 5 of your deck and add an Ominagruzio to your hand. If you can't add it to hand, you do 2 soul charges. Then the grade 2 Omina Owls puts a trigger from your deck into your soul, and then you get to draw if you actually put the trigger in soul. Furthermore, then you have the main unit, Ominagruzio himself. On place, he searches the top 5 for another Ominagruzio or Mask of Hydrogram and add it to your hand. And for Soul Blast, he can bind a trigger and make sure that those triggers don't trigger defensively for your opponent. So like I said, it is a Masque deck. That means, of course, that we run 4 versions of Ominagruzio Masques, and we also run 4 versions of Mask of Hydrogram. Especially now that the format went to 54 cards in total, definitely want to run 4 Hydrograms because this deck literally does nothing if you cannot get your Masque. That's the only unfortunate side effect of this deck's tactic, is that the main grade 3 unit doesn't do anything relevant unless you do your Masque persona right. Anyway, the Masque version of this card is very, very cool. If it of course has the regular Masque version skills, then it can also restand if you counterblast 1 and put 2 of your back row rear guards into the soul. But the best part of this card is if it removes another version of Ominagruzio from the game, you can bind another trigger, and every type of trigger that's bound is gonna be deactivated for your opponent during your turn, and those triggers also get -5 shields in their hand. So this deck plays very passively, but you get a lot more advantage than you think. Side note, the effects still activate, so a draw trigger is still gonna draw, a heal trigger is still gonna heal, critical trigger is still gonna crit, but it's the power that it shuts down. So they cannot bank on defensives. Of course, to support that and to make sure that you can do it every turn, you run 3 extra copies of the main Ominagruzio. And then we have one of the best cards for this deck from the latest set, Lindalkia. So she is honestly a 3-in-1 card. She is a beat stick, she's a plus engine, and she accelerates the triggers that you can bind. On place, as long as you have a Masque Vanguard, that's very important. You can check top 5 and call something that's not her, and then you can bind something from your drop zone, like a trigger from your drop zone. If you have 3 triggers bound, then she gets a free plus 10k. So this is the main card that gets your deck immediately active, and make sure that you already have 3 triggers bound on your first grade 3 turn. Next is another form of advantage, honestly, for the deck, Ruin Collector. So this card on place lets you soul charge. It's optional, so you don't have to if you're low on deck size, or if you just don't want to. The best part about this card is that it counts as 2 rear guards. So when you're using your Ominagruzio Masque, you can just put only this in the soul and your Masque will restand. So that makes the restand very, very plusy. We have a way to kind of abuse Ruin Collector, and that's Demon Sherider. First of all, it's a Dragon Tree Wretch, so it's a good target for the Mask of Hydrogram already. And for 2 Soul Blast, you can get any grade 1 or less unit from the soul back out. So you can keep getting your Ruin Collector out and recycling it so that you can keep restanding your Vanguard every turn. The next card is Misery Wing. This is your main beat stick guy, but he's also a very nice way to get advantage. When placed for Soul Blast 2, you can draw a card as long as there's 2 cards in the bind zone, and then it gets plus 5k for every type of trigger you have in your bind zone. So not for every trigger, for every type. So 5k for a crit, 5k for a heal, 5k for a draw. So ideally, you find a way to bind all 5 of your triggers, and then this card just gets plus 25k for free. And next is a little bit of a tech option for me. Because this is a Masque deck, you're gonna persona write a lot usually. You can also very easily search your persona write with the Masques and with the top 5 checks. This card is just a way to control your opponents a little bit more if they are sacking or if they're getting a little bit out of control. This card, for Counterblast, you can put 3 rear guards into their soul, and for every card you put, it gets +5. So it's also a really nice beat stick. It's only 2 because it's not really the main strategy of the deck, and most of the time you're not really gonna need it. It's also a little bit Counterblast heavy for the deck right now. Then up next, we have the Jeweled Beast. This card is really just in there for the extra defensive power, so it gets +15k shield if you can remove 2 cards from the right deck, or if, better put, if you put the right deck cards back into right deck from soul or from drop. But it can also give you a counter charge, so you rarely use it for that skill, but it can come in helpful when you're damage denied, for example. Ideally, you also only just want to use this once per game, because the Ominagruzio from right deck you ideally want to use for the Ominagruzio Masques skill to remove, so this probably is going to rotate out as well when the promo for Evil Eye and Almagistar is released. Then we have 3 of the standard PGs and 1 of the Blitz Order PG. And because we're a Vanguard restand deck, we're definitely gonna go for 8 crits. Now, disclaimer for Ominagruzio, you're probably not gonna check a lot of your triggers when you exactly want them, because you don't really filter that much unless you're really, really lucky on your top 5 checks. And you also just want to see your triggers early, ideally, so that you can bind them from your drop zone as well. You can still be threatening with the triggers. Next, of course, for heals. I don't think I need to explain that. Next, we are going for the Dark States over trigger. Again, because you're a Vanguard restand deck, this is ideal. Your Vanguard just gets 10k and a crit if you check it early. So that's perfect for restanding Vanguards. And next, for my final 3 trigger slots, I went for 2 fronts and 1 draw. Now the idea here is actually that your grade 2 of the right line Omina Owls is just going to search out the draw trigger and put it into your soul, because most of the decks still run like 3 draw triggers instead of 3 fronts. So it's very nice to be able to search it out in the beginning of the game and make sure you can bind it later with your Ominagruzio skills. And for the rest, just 2 fronts for the extra shield, because your hand is usually already pretty good in Ominagruzio, and front triggers make your numbers absolutely unblockable, because your opponent's shields all get decreased ideally. Well, that was a quick overview of my deck. Now I'm going to show you an ideal first grade 3 turn for Ominagruzio. Alright, so here is how you ideally do your first grade 3 Ominagruzio turn. In this scenario, let's also say that you went second, because that's always what you want to do as Ominagruzio. So if you have the choice, definitely always go second, let your opponent start. It's always best for you. So we're gonna ride for the turn. You can always discard your other original Ominagruzios because you don't really need them, and they're perfect discard fodder for your right deck and for your PGs, and you want them in your drop zone anyway. So then you ride your original Ominagruzio. His skill lets you check the top 5, and you can add other Ominagruzios or Masques of Hydrogram to your hand. First and foremost, remember to use your first binding skill. So Soul Blast, your draw trigger, that you will have ideally put with Omina Owls. And then the first trigger you always want to bind, if you have it available of course, is your critical trigger. Almost every opponent, like 99% of your opponents, are gonna have 8 criticals in their deck. So binding this one means that half of the triggers will not activate during their defensives. So that's already amazing enough. Next, you can do your top 5 search with your Mask of Hydrogram. Okay, so we whiff on this one. That's honestly gonna happen quite often, if I'm honest, but it doesn't really matter because that's not why you play it. You play it for the Persona ride. So there we go. Now we are in our ideal Ominagruzio Mask. And now during your ideal first grade 3 turn, you will have a Lindalkia in hand, because she is the perfect way to already accelerate your binds. So with her skill, you can check top 5, and you can call a card from among them, and then you can bind a trigger from your drop zone. Now, heal triggers have second priority over critical triggers, because you know for a fact that every deck is gonna run 4 heal triggers. So that's then bounds. Fun parts, because you bound your second card, Misery Wing is immediately active, so you can immediately use a Soul Blast 2 to draw cards. Then you call a Ruin Collector from your hand. The order of this is not, by the way, is particularly important. You can also call a Ruin Collector from your top 5, a Misery Wing from your hand. These are just the pieces you definitely want on your first turn. So Ruin Collector, you can do a Soul Charge. And then you are set to activate your Ominagruzio Mask. So the Ominagruzio we discarded earlier, you can remove it from the game, and then you can bind a third trigger. Now, depending on your matchup, you can choose whether you want to bind the draw and the front, and also depending on whether you have both of them available. I still think that like about 60% of people are running draw triggers. So I usually prefer draws, but if you see in the early game that they're running fronts, you obviously try to go for the front trigger. So there you go. Now, ideally, all triggers in your opponent's deck are shut down and have less shield value. Then you can start your attacks. Misery Wing already has plus 15,000 because you have 3 types of trigger in the bind zone, and then Dalkia has 10,000 because you have 3 triggers in the bind zone. Order of attacks, because you run front triggers, you just go with the Vanguard first, and because you don't have to worry about defensives, it doesn't really matter which power level you choose to go first with. So you can go for your Vanguard first, you do your drive checks, oh, there we go, critical trigger. After that, you can use the restand skill, because Ruin Collector is 2 cards, that's the only card you need, and you can restand it. And then it swings again for 1 less drive, another critical trigger, and then you swing with your last rear guards. Doesn't look impressive at first, but remember these are Persona right numbers almost every single turn with huge power buffs, and your opponent's shields are constantly decreased. So it's honestly very, very annoying for the opponent to guard as well, because they have to think completely differently about all their shield values. So played against my own deck, and I can attest to the fact that it's not fun to play against. Especially when they have units that can come swinging at you with like 35 and 45 power while you have reduced trigger power, and you cannot bank on defensives. So honestly, a little tip for this deck as well, always just assume you can kill. Because they may have a giant hand, but the -5 shield does a really big number on their hand size, honestly. So at any point you can honestly just kill them dead. Alright, I hope you enjoyed my little dive into Ominagruzio. It's definitely one of my favorite decks right now. And if you have any questions on how to build it or some of my choices, feel free to put them in the comments below. Bye bye!